my last election.
Yeah.
After my election, I have more flexibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I transmit this information to Vladimir and as that
and we'll be monitoring very carefully the situation, recognizing that along with our European partners and the international community, there will be consequences if people step over the line.
President Obama's defense chief says he wants to reduce Army troop levels to numbers last seen in 1940 and ground an entire class of Air Force warplanes, all moves said to be supported by the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
The Pentagon today recommending some steep budget cuts for our nation's Army, actually explaining how they're going to deal with the budget cuts that could bring their levels to the lowest since before World War II.
Well, former Army Vice Chief of Staff General Jack Keane says cuts are understandable, but these are disproportionate to the rest of the federal budget. Keane says about cutting the Army, this is cutting into a deterrent force that prevents wars from happening and is a military that is capable of responding if called by the Commander-in-Chief. The retiring chairman of the House Armed Services Committee sounds concerned as well.
In the last few years, we have changed our strategy that has stood us well since World War II, that we should be able to be equipped, ready to go, 2 major contingencies at a time. We have cut that back to fight one and hold one.
Russia is making good on a recent promise to expand its military footprint around the globe. A Russian warship is docked in Cuba's Havana harbor this morning. That's about 100 miles from Florida. The ship quietly floated into the cruise terminal with no explanation from Cuban state media. The Russian ship is from a class generally used for intelligence gathering.
North Korea fired 4 short-range missiles off its eastern coast this morning. The missiles were fired from a site near the border with South Korea. That's according to South Korea's defense ministry. The North has fired short-range missiles into the Sea of Japan in the past during military exercises.
We believe National Security Advisor Rice has made it very clear, and I've made it clear, that intervention would, in our judgment, be a very grave mistake.
We are watching to see, as the Secretary said, whether or not Russia is doing anything that might be crossing the line in any way. We strongly support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we expect other nations to do the same. We urge all parties to avoid steps that could be misinterpreted or lead to a miscalculation at this delicate time.
Тем более новостного. Ебать, сколько у них гранатометов.
Ни хрена себе. Какой там 10 человек?
Через 10 минут на ФТП выложен с 2 камер захват. Сейчас 3-ю камеру обрабатываем. Ну и каждые там 15 минут будем новую камеру туда выкладывать. Да, сейчас заливаем, мы тебе сразу смс. Ага, добро, давай.
Ian Lee joins us now live from Kiev. Ian, what can you tell us about reports that the airport there has been shut down and the airspace closed?
Well, Jake, the men that have taken this airport or who have been there, I think we don't know who they are, but I think what we are seeing is the most telling. These are very professional looking soldiers. They have new equipment, new uniforms, and they're moving in a ways that it's not would be like a ragtag force. Now, we don't know why the airspace has been closed. Neither the civil administration here in Kiev or in the Crimea has given any reason why or when it will reopen again, but definitely tense times here.
What do you know about reports of the Russian military moving directly into Crimea?
This is something we've been watching all day, whether it be YouTube videos or on multiple local networks. We're seeing helicopters, at least 11 helicopters moving across the Crimea towards an area called Baalbek. We're also seeing armored personnel carriers rumbling down the streets of the Crimea, a YouTube video of that. And all this really is backed up by the government, saying what we're witnessing is an annexation of the area. And as you pointed out earlier as well, a pro-Russian television station has, what we're hearing are Marines from the Black Sea Fleet securing it to make sure that it's not tampered with as well. And as well, we're also hearing is that that these forces are moving toward an area of the capital, Sevastopol.
So, Ian, as Ukrainian authorities say that there has been an invasion of some sort, have they decided what to do? Any movements, for instance, by the Ukrainian military?
Well, yeah, the government is basically calling this an invasion, an annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. They've called for restraint from the Russians. They're saying that the Russians need to leave, but they're also saying that the Ukrainian military needs to show restraint. They're saying they don't want any more bloodshed. And right behind me here in Kiev, they're still mourning the people who died in those bloody protests. Just very recent, dozens of people died there. They're still mourning. They don't want to see any more bloodshed. They're trying to go to the international community. They're trying to go to the United Nations Security Council, which is convening. They're trying to also go to the European Union to send monitors here to make sure that the sovereignty of Ukraine is respected, Jake.
Bob Schieffer today spoke with Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel about U.S. military options. Bob, what did he have to say?
Well, I'll tell you, Scott, it was just before the president spoke, and he pointedly told me it would be a mistake if the Russians move forces into other parts of Ukraine.
This could be a very dangerous situation if this continues in a very provocative way.
Давай, ты уступаешь. Я, видя, через перевал, через Волчьи ворота еду, связь пропадает. Боевом.
The latest is about half an hour ago, I left the airport at Simferopol, which has been under the control of unidentified soldiers since overnight early this morning. I'm on the highway right now, about 10 kilometers from that airport, and what I've seen in the past several minutes are about half a dozen Russian military troop transporters. I'm saying Russian because these are trucks that bore Russian license plates. They were carrying troops. We briefly saw that they were troops, armed troops. They were all headed in the same direction. They bifurcated in a road. Some started going on the road towards Yalta, but pulled over, perhaps because they saw us following behind them. But what we can definitely confirm at this hour is that there are Russian military troop transporters with armed soldiers inside, Russian license plates. They are on the move, and they are going somewhere, half a dozen of them. So there's definitely some military movement adrift, and Ukrainians we've been speaking to say that this is inhabitual. They are not accustomed to seeing Russian trucks, Russian military trucks, carrying armed men on the roads in and around this capital. They began seeing them really yesterday, early yesterday, and today there seems to be a heavier presence. We saw lots of trucks coming and going earlier today from the airport, but like I said, I'm right now on a highway outside the airport, and there are Russian military trucks on the move at this hour.
And Douglas, is there any sign of any Ukrainian troops?
If there are Ukrainian troops, I have not seen them today. Obviously, Ukraine does have a standing army. Ukraine does have troops, but the only troop presence that has been visible, at least to us today, and we have been around mostly the airport area and the areas in and around the airport, it has been soldiers in unmarked uniforms. When you ask Ukrainians who these soldiers are, they will tell you they're not ours. They're not nashi. They are, they say in Ukrainian, they say they are Russian troops. But like I said, we cannot confirm their identity, only to say they're unidentified, believed to perhaps be Russian because they have been accompanied by pro-Russian militants not in uniform who've been keeping journalists and other curious members of the public away from them wherever they happen to be patrolling. But the main news at this hour, I can say, is yes, the airport in Simferopol remains under the control of these unidentified soldiers bearing machine guns, in some cases rocket-propelled grenades. And outside, on the roads outside the airport, there are Russian military trucks on the move. Where they're going, unknown at this hour. Sometimes they pull over on the road and stop to let other cars pass, but they are definitely going somewhere.
And how are the civilians on the ground reacting to this presence?
There seems to be a lot of confusion. People asking us as journalists today, what's going on, who are these people? So there's really confusion all around. There seems to be uncertainty and a sense of who is really in control here right now in Crimea, because every morning you wake up and it seems to be a new story, with either the parliament under control of armed men, this morning being both airports here, civilian and military, other government buildings. So there's real sense of uncertainty among the local population. Who is controlling things? Which military powers are in control? If there are Ukrainian troops, like you were saying earlier, where are they? Why aren't they visible at this hour? Are these Russian troops, and if so, are they trying to take control of key installations in this region at this hour?
Over the last several days, the United States has been responding to events as they unfold in Ukraine. Now, throughout this crisis, we have been very clear about one fundamental principle. The Ukrainian people deserve the opportunity to determine their own future. Together with our European allies, we have urged an end to the violence and encouraged Ukrainians to pursue a course in which they stabilize their country, forge a broad-based government, and move to elections this spring. I also spoke several days ago with President Putin, and my administration has been in daily communication with Russian officials. And we've made clear that they can be part of an international community's effort to support the stability and success of a united Ukraine going forward, which is not only in the interest of the people of Ukraine and the international community, but also in Russia's interests. However, we are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Russia has a historic relationship with Ukraine, including cultural and economic ties, and a military facility in Crimea. But any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing, which is not in the interest of Ukraine, Russia, or Europe. It would represent a profound interference in matters that must be determined by the Ukrainian people. It would be a clear violation of Russia's commitment to respect the independence and sovereignty and borders of Ukraine and of international laws. And just days after the world came to Russia for the Olympic Games, it would invite the condemnation of nations around the world. And indeed, the United States will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine. The events of the past several months remind us of how difficult democracy can be in a country with deep divisions. But the Ukrainian people have also reminded us that human beings have a universal right to determine their own future. Right now, the situation remains very fluid. Vice President Biden just spoke with the Prime Minister of Ukraine to assure him that in this difficult moment, the United States supports his government's efforts and stands for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and democratic future of Ukraine. I also commend the Ukrainian government's restraint and its commitment to uphold its international obligations. We will continue to coordinate closely with our European allies. We will continue to communicate directly with the Russian government, and we will continue to keep all of you in the press corps and the American people informed as events develop. Thanks very much.
Нихера себе! Это да! Охренеть!
At this hour, it appears Russian military forces are crossing the border into neighboring Ukraine, in a region of Ukraine known as Crimea. Late today, President Obama went on national television to warn Russia against a military intervention. Ukraine has been reeling since last week when a popular revolt led the president of Ukraine to flee to Russia. Crimea used to be part of Russia and has long wanted to return. Ukraine says Russian attack helicopters and military transports have taken two key airports in Crimea.
We've got a Fox News alert for you right now. Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Colby. Russia's parliament has just unanimously approved sending troops to Ukraine. Russian military trucks and soldiers are already making their presence very well known in the Crimean capital. They're taking control of the airports there, and they're putting their Black Sea fleet on high alert. Now, President Obama is warning there will be costs if Russia decides on military intervention. The Kremlin is now expected to recall the Russian ambassador to the U.S. And Ukraine's interim president is bracing for military action, calling for an emergency meeting of his security chiefs. Some of those members are now calling for a general military mobilization after Russia's announcement, as foreign ministers in the EU schedule an emergency meeting of their own in Brussels, Belgium, that is expected to take place on Monday.
The United States calls upon Russia to pull back the military forces that are being built up in the region, to stand down and to allow the Ukrainian people the opportunity to pursue their own government, create their own destiny, and to do so freely without intimidation or fear.
All right, get you back now to our top story, the crisis in Ukraine. That was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, calling on Russia to back off. She also spoke before the UN Security Council emergency meeting earlier today. Ukraine is now heading to a possible showdown with Russia, its powerful neighbor, with the acting president of Ukraine ordering the armed forces to be at full readiness and warning Russia to stay away. It's now early Sunday morning in Kiev, where the people are bracing for military action. They're moving very quickly in Ukraine, which may be on the brink of all-out war.
What Russia is doing now in Ukraine violates the principles of the United Nations Charter. It threatens peace and security in Europe. Russia must stop its military activities and its threats. We support Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. We support the rights of the people of Ukraine to determine their own future without outside interference. And we emphasize the need for Ukraine to continue to uphold the democratic rights of all people and ensure that minority rights are protected. We urge all parties to urgently continue all efforts to move away from this dangerous situation.
A senior U.S. official tells CNN that Russian forces now, quote, have complete operational control of the Crimean Peninsula. The official said the U.S. estimates there are now some 6,000 Russian ground and naval forces in the region. Also, we have just learned that Secretary of State John Kerry will travel to Kiev, Ukraine on Tuesday. Kerry has condemned Russia's, quote, incredible act of aggression and warned of economic punishment. But again, returning to that main headline there, U.S. official confirming to CNN that it is Russian forces that have complete operational control of Crimea, the peninsula in Ukraine that has really been the center of this and the site of a major and important Russian naval base. Now, President Obama told Russian President Vladimir Putin that his moves against Ukraine will have consequences well after this conflict over Crimea is finished. The two leaders spoke for an hour and a half yesterday. Putin says Russian people in that part of Ukraine need his military help and, in fact, are requesting it. But Ukraine's acting prime minister calls Russia's troop movement into his country, quote, a declaration of war.
And we start with this morning, a Fox News alert, because Ukraine's new prime minister saying his country on the brink of disaster, telling Russian President Vladimir Putin to pull back his troops.
Well, President Obama
urging
the same thing in a phone call with Putin. But this morning, Russian troops continue to move through Ukraine's Crimea region. And Peter Ducey is live in Washington, D.C. with the latest. Good morning.
Good morning, Anna. And President Obama warned Putin during that hour-and-a-half-long phone call yesterday that Russia risks negatively impacting their standing in the international community if they continue sending forces into Ukraine. But all indications this morning are that Russian forces continue to move into Ukraine, justifying their aggression by saying that ultra-nationals within Ukraine are threatening Russians. In the last hour, we got word that Ukraine has now officially shut down its airspace to all non-civilian aircraft. They're trying basically to isolate Russian forces in the Crimean Peninsula. At the United Nations yesterday, the Ukrainian ambassador publicly called the deposed Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych crazy, and the U.S. ambassador is calling out Russians now for violating international law.
We are deeply disturbed by reports this morning of Russian military intervention into Crimea. This intervention is without legal basis. Indeed, it violates Russia's commitment to protect the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of Ukraine. It is time for the Russian intervention in Ukraine to end.
The president's national security team had a meeting at the White House yesterday to talk about potential policy options. After that meeting, Susan Rice briefed President Obama on what his advisors came up with. Right now in Ukraine, all military reserves have been called up, and officials in Ukraine are making sure that all those reserves are ready to fight. Back to you.
Crisis situation. All right, Peter Ducey, thanks so much for it. Let's right now bring in Fox News senior military analyst Colonel Oliver North. Colonel, nice to have you on the show this morning to get your perspective on this. Colonel, right now it seems we've got the Crimean president saying, Russia, come in. We want you here. You've got a lot of support there in that region for Russia. And then, of course, you have the Ukrainian president saying, get out. What do we do?
Well, let's back up just a second here, because last week, in fact, last Sunday, I said that Putin was going to act as soon as the Sochi Olympics were over. And even before the torch went out, he sent an intelligence collection ship to Havana Harbor and put more intelligence technicians into the Lourdes Signals Intelligence Site, which has been there, by the way, since the 1960s. Obama is now saying that we're going to continue to coordinate with our NATO allies and see what they can come up with. Here's what's going to happen. They are going to have a big powwow
They're waiting until Monday to start it. That means nothing is going to happen because it doesn't mean anything to Putin. He is committed to reconstitute a newer, better version of his evil empire. The video and photos that Peter just showed are very clearly that Russian Spetsnaz troops were the very first in there, then their naval infantry, which is their Marine Corps, and they now control Crimea, all the key ports, airports, naval facilities, communications hubs, and they have to because Putin isn't going to give up Sevastopol, Russia's major, largest warm water port. Tartus in Syria was why Putin wouldn't give up Syria and backing the Assad regime. And so the U.S. and the Europeans are going to refer this to the UN. Neither the U.S. or the Europeans have any real options. Look at 7 pipelines out of 11 run from Russia through Ukraine. And so if all Putin wants to do to stop the Europeans from doing something, shut off the oil and gas in the middle of winter and threaten sanctions, that means you're going to end up with the Americans losing their northern access to Afghanistan. This is Czechoslovakia 1938, the Munich Conference. All it lacks is Neville Chamberlain telling us we've got peace for our time.
What is Putin afraid of? That Ukraine will join the EU or God forbid, NATO in his mind? What is the end game for him?
Well, remember, we missed the opportunity, we collectively, the Europeans and the Obama administration, of making Ukraine a full member of NATO. We should have invited them to do so. They're a, quote, partner, which means nothing under the NATO Collective Security Act. Military force is no longer an option out there. Putin knows that we only have 2 carriers at sea, one in the Indian Ocean and the other one off the Atlantic coast. Remember the other day in the budget talks, they said we got 11 carriers? We don't. We only have 10, and only 2 are actually deployed. What Putin can do is close that northern logistics access to Afghanistan and impose real serious sanctions on us. And of course, through all of this, the Chinese, the Iranians are watching this feeble response as we're gutting our defenses and they're planning their own next moves. It's not a good picture.
Colonel, we know that President Obama and President Putin spoke on the phone for about an hour and a half yesterday. Do you think the President Obama understands the gravity of the situation and how important Ukraine really is?
No. In fact, I don't think that they recognize that this is a foretaste of what's to come if we continue the path that we're on for unilateral disarmament. We've got to stop battering our allies like Israel with the lunacy of trading land for peace. We need to build the XL pipeline, which our Canadian allies want us to do, and the Obama administration can't figure out how to do it. If the Iranians close the Straits of Hormuz next week, the price of oil is going to go through the roof and the economy is going to grind to a halt. All of these are the kinds of things that happen when America decides, A, we're not going to lead, and B, we're going to destroy the opportunity to deter this kind of action with a strong military. We no longer have that military.
Colonel, you remember President George W. Bush going through something similar when Russia moved against Georgia, the country of Georgia. Right. It seemed like limited options on the table for President Bush at the time, and even Russia didn't adhere to the ceasefire agreement that ended up being put in place. So it seemed like President Obama was taking a page from that playbook here, but it seems anemic. What can we really do?
Well, this is a page not only from that playbook, but it's also a playbook that Jimmy Carter wrote back in the 70s. Because when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, Carter was shocked and surprised. It's a page out of the playbook, as I say, of 1938 with Czechoslovakia.
Right.
When the Europeans decided, didn't even invite the Czechs into the conference, made them wait outside for the results of it, which basically said, Adolf Hitler, go ahead and annex Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
That's what's going to happen here.
Hey, would things be different if we had that missile defense in Poland right now?
Absolutely right. The missile defense system that this administration shut down, carefully negotiated over years by the Bush administration, protecting not just us in the homeland, but our European allies. They're looking at that and saying, the Russians are modernizing their nuclear forces, their delivery systems, and we're not even defending our population centers, neither are the Americans. You gotta wonder, what is it that this administration wants to do?
I think your point is well taken, Colonel, that modernizing a new form of Russia under Vladimir Putin and moving against these different regions, I think you're absolutely right about that, Colonel. Fascinating perspective this morning. Thank you so much for joining us, as always.
I wish it were better news, but it's not.
Yeah.